Good morning. Last day of GDC. Thank you for all coming out. I know if I wasn't giving a talk, I probably wouldn't be here, so I really appreciate you coming out for my presentation. My name's Christina Norman, and this is kind of a general design talk about Mass Effect 2 and Mass Effect 1, the differences between them, and the design process we went through in developing the sequel. So a little bit of information about myself. I'm the lead gameplay designer on Mass Effect 2. I also worked on Mass Effect 1, but I actually worked on Mass Effect 1 as a programmer. Mass Effect 2 was my first design title. And that's really interesting in itself, coming from the programming side to the design side, because they're so different. While I was very intimately involved in Mass Effect 1 through the entire process, I wasn't really responsible for the design or the gameplay. So going into work on the sequel and making changes to that gameplay, it's a little strange. It's like approaching things from a different side. In terms of my background, I have a computer science degree. I'm a programmer. I've got a lot of experience in pen and paper role-playing games. Traditionally, I would say I'm like an extremely hardcore RPG nerd, which is not a big shock for a BioWare employee, but maybe it might seem a little bit shocking if you look at Mass Effect 2, just because in Mass Effect 2, a lot of the ways in which we pushed the game weren't in the role-playing direction. Now, designing Mass Effect 2 was a team effort. There were so many people involved in the design process. I've got a picture of a few of them up there. I've got my boss, Preston Watomniuk, and a bunch of other designers who worked on gameplay design. But this is only a small fraction of the number of people who actually contributed to Mass Effect 2's design. In one way or another, virtually the entire team had input into that process. And I want to acknowledge that while I'm going to be up here talking about our design process and design, I didn't come up with everything myself, and Mass Effect 2 wouldn't have been the game that it turned out to be without the help of all those people. So Mass Effect 1 to Mass Effect 2. Let's go back a little bit and just kind of refresh all of our memories of Mass Effect 1. Could I just get people in the audience, put up your hand if you haven't played Mass Effect 1? Okay. All right. Well, so most people have, but let's go into a little bit of the details. So Mass Effect 1 was an action RPG, maybe a shooter RPG. I'd say it was more of an action RPG. It was a brand new IP for BioWare. We had never done a Mass Effect game before. We came up with this incredibly rich science fiction IP, and this was our first game for it. It sold really well, and it did very well critically as well. So the point of mentioning this is, it's not that I'm trying to brag. I'm just trying to set like the basis for, we had a successful game. We were going to go in and do a sequel. What do you generally expect when you're doing a sequel to a successful game? Well, usually I would expect polish and some additional features building on what was already there to add something new. But we did something more radical with Mass Effect 2. Mass Effect 1 also had a lot of fans, and I was trying to think like, well, how can I do a slide about fans, especially since I don't want to go and take pictures of all of them. So I grabbed a bunch of fan art. I think fan art is an awesome way to tell how people feel about your games, because if they're going to go and create original artwork based on your game, then that's a really nice way of measuring just their passion and their interest. And the other reason why I want to talk a bit about Mass Effect 1's fans is because as a designer working on a sequel, I feel I have a responsibility to those fans. Fans are more than just sales. Your hardcore fans, the ones who really, really love your game, they're like the lifeblood of the game. On some level, we're all involved in design because we want to make games that will make people happy. So those really hardcore fans are just so important, and in many ways, they're the reason why I like making games. And I think cosplay is another great way to measure how popular your game is, because if people are doing cosplay of your characters, then especially this, like making a latex hood for herself there. I mean, that's passion. And here's a little Mass Effect 1 gameplay clip. All of the videos you're going to see in this presentation are taken from YouTube, which seemed like an awesome idea when I was planning the presentation. In retrospect, though, I've come to realize that YouTube videos are not always the highest quality. This is actually a promo video that we did, and it's just showing off Mass Effect 1's gameplay. So I'm just going to pause here. Is this a good time to highlight the power wheel? It was one of the core gameplay features in Mass Effect 1. So right now what's happened is the player has paused the game and they brought up this awesome wheel interface that lets them access all the powers and abilities of their crew. And late in the game you could have up to 20 abilities going on that you or your squad members had access to. And each of those abilities can have a separate cooldown, like you'll see a couple of the icons there right now. They're grayed out, and they've got this little progress bar showing when they'll be available again. So there's a lot of information there. And that was kind of one of the key gameplay features for Mass Effect 1. It was saying you can play it in real time, but you can also pause at any time and access this menu to unleash an attack or even just to evaluate the tactical situation on the battlefield. One of the issues I had with this approach, though, was that it wasn't optional. Like in this case, a few seconds earlier, the character actually cast lift because they had that map to a button, but you could only map one ability in Mass Effect 1. So to access any of the other abilities, you must pause like we're doing right now. Awesome, there he goes. One less Krogan to worry about. Okay, well, let's move on to Mass Effect 2. So just again, who here has not played Mass Effect 2? Okay, actually a few more people there. Well, it did just come out, but I hope you'll all check it out. So Mass Effect 2, very much like Mass Effect 1, I would say it's more of a shooter RPG than an action RPG. And like you hope when you make a sequel, it's been selling better than the original. That's kind of the way it works. And critically acclaimed. We did better than we did on Mass Effect 1, which was great. I don't think we were expecting to do as well as we did, but it's nice to get that kind of feedback. But not all the feedback was positive. Still got fans. They're still making cool fan art. All this fan art, by the way, is available in my slides, which are on the internet. There's going to be a link at the end, so if you want to check any of this out, there's links in there. And let's take a look at Mass Effect 2's gameplay. This video is a little dark, so I hope you guys can see it all right. So we've got a soldier here. There's actually, let me just back up here. So yeah, there's a lot more emphasis in general in Mass Effect 2 on real-time gameplay, guns, and cover. We really tried to push that. We've still got the Power Wheel interface that's available if you're playing on 360, but you don't have to use it as often. I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Okay, so in addition to just the general, reviews of the game came out like they did for all games, there's been a fair amount of interest in just how much Mass Effect has changed. So I'm just going to read a couple quotes here from a Gamma Sutra article. I found myself constantly surprised by how much the game had been heavily redesigned. And nearly every major player-exposed gameplay system for the first game was considerably tweaked or completely redesigned. So, big focus on redesigning the game. And not everybody was happy with the redesign. Overall, the reviews were really great, but this is a selection of threads taken from BioWare's own forums where some individuals posted that they didn't like the changes. We've got thread titles like Mass Effect 2 is not an RPG. Mass Effect 2, Gears of War with interactive dialogue, BioWare ruined Mass Effect, and why won't BioWare pay my taxes, wash my car, and cook me dinner? So, yeah, not everybody liked the change. This is a relatively small percentage of the overall posts, but it was still, it was significant enough that we definitely noticed. So why are Mass Effect 1 and Mass Effect 2 so different? So when I was doing this, I had to, it was actually a really great process because, like I think many presenters, first I came up with a review topic and then I figured out, what was I actually going to say. I really took some time. I sat down, I went back and looked at exactly what was going on right when we finished Mass Effect 1. You're working hard on a game, you're crunching, it's over, you see the sales, you see the reviews, and your head starts to clear, and you get some perspective, and you realize that you achieved a lot of what you wanted to with the game, but there were other things you didn't, and then you're also at the same time getting all this feedback from reviewers and fans, and a lot of it is really insightful because you've been so close to your game for so long. You don't have that same perspective that reviewers and fans have. So we knew we could make a better Mass Effect. And as a first engine game, an incredibly ambitious, complex first engine game, we knew we hadn't achieved everything that we'd wanted from Mass Effect 1. And to be honest, as designers, there's always a temptation to just redo everything from scratch as well. It's important to just be aware of that so that, when you're redesigning your systems, you can say, hey, do I really need to redesign this, or is this just because I thought of something 5% better, but it's not really worth it? So we had a process for review analysis, which was really helpful. And I don't think it's specifically using our process, which is, you don't need to do that for your game, but doing some review analysis I think is really helpful. So we did quantitative and qualitative analysis, which means we looked at, just go forward. Here we go. So quantitative analysis, we essentially just, after reading through all the reviews, we made notes of all the different things we wanted to measure responses on. And then through each review, we went through and we actually collected it all and as just kind of a rough score in terms of were some people saying something positive here, were they saying something negative? And the goal was not to, come out with a bunch of numbers at the end and say, okay, this is going to decide what we're going to change, but it was to give perspective. One of the things I've noticed in doing review analysis is often there'll be like 3 guys who are really, really passionate about one thing. And then when you're done reading all the reviews, you're like, wow, yeah, everyone really liked that or really hated it. But then when you look at it objectively, you see actually there wasn't, it wasn't like a big consensus or anything. It was just a few guys. And qualitative is just collecting all of like the most impactful quotes so that when you actually say, okay, we're going to revise a feature like inventory, let's go back and let's look at like the quotes that we felt really captured what people were saying about this system. And I'm going to show another video here, which is my own pet issue from Mass Effect 1. And in a way, this was the most important issue in that it kind of started a cascade when we were working on this issue. It resulted in a bunch of other changes. And this is the accuracy at level 1 issue. So just a bit of background there. Mass Effect 1 as an RPG, when you're shooting your gun, whether you hit or not is not really dependent on, whether you're lining up that perfect shot. As long as you're like vaguely pointed at the guy, we're rolling dice. Just like D&D, we're rolling dice, figuring out whether you're going to hit or not. And hey, we all know at level 1, you're not very good. You don't really know how to use your weapons. So here we go. Blast from the past with Jenkins here. Now this is actually me. Switch into my assault rifle. And I'm trying to take out these drones. My weapon overheats and all right. There are these little markers. I don't know if you can see them very well, but it's kind of in a triangle shape. And those are showing my accuracy, and it's just a really wide cone. I think Caden eventually kills this guy. Yeah, that was Caden. So the reason why this was a problem was for a new player coming in who's, not an RPG expert, they picked up this game like, oh, this looks like a cool game. They don't know what's going on. They're just like, I don't understand. When I play Gears of War and I fire my assault rifle, I hit things fine. Why can't I hit anything in this game? What's going on? And it's a bit of a sort of like if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it should be a duck issue. Looking at that gameplay footage, it looks like a shooter. It looks like a shooter, but it's a shooter where you can't hit anything. So a lot of people had very valid feedback of saying, you know what, like, why can't I just hit guys when I'm pointing my gun at them? I'm used to this. Every game does this except your game. Why is that? So that was something we wanted to fix. So yeah, we wanted more satisfying combat, and a big part of that is making weapons feel accurate and powerful at level 1. Basically saying, let's take the RPG out of the shooter, because there's already so many great shooters out there. We look like a shooter. That aspect of our combat should play like a shooter. We wanted real-time combat, and this feeds back into making it again feel more like a good shooter, in that there's no other shooters out there where you need to pause in order to do things on periodically, like access your abilities. So we wanted to make it more possible for you to actually fight in real time. We wanted cover to be really useful. Cover in Mass Effect 1 was sometimes useful, but sometimes it wasn't. And really that was mostly just a design issue in terms of how we were laying out cover, how the enemies were behaving. But there were so many situations in Mass Effect 1 where being in cover was a bad idea that many players abandoned cover entirely. So we knew we wanted to make cover really, really useful or cut it completely. That was the other option on the table. And we wanted there to be a feeling of intensity. Like many RPGs, it's kind of a trope of RPGs is when you end up with the right build and you've got all your gear on, all of a sudden you can just waltz in and just crush people completely. And at that moment, the intensity is lost. You may get a bit of a cerebral sort of like, oh, my build's so awesome, I've got this great sword, I'm killing guys. But that isn't a very good feeling for shooter combat. If you're just going in and bullets are bouncing off you, you're not taking any damage, that is not satisfying. So we wanted to make sure that feeling of intensity was kept at all the time. We wanted you to have meaningful progression, but at the same time feel that you never were in a position where you just couldn't be killed by anybody because you were so amazing. We wanted a better inventory system. Now, spoilers, there wasn't an inventory system in ME2, but what we wanted was a better one. But what does better mean? So I look back at some of our original notes. We wanted you to be able to equip your entire squad easily. In Mass Effect 1, you had 5 squad members, and it was a pain to equip them. You could only equip guys if they were with you on a mission. So if Rex was back on the Normandy and I wanted to steal his shotgun and give it to Tally, I couldn't do that. I'd have to actually either get them together, or else I'd have to go to this weapon locker interface and unequip it and put it somewhere, and then go to Tally's locker and equip it onto her. It was a pain. We also wanted the GUI to be great. The most common criticism of Mass Effect 1's inventory system was just that the GUI was not very intuitive. It was a weird GUI. And we wanted you to be able to upgrade your weapons. In Mass Effect 1, until you got the very best weapons in the game, you'd pick up a gun and you'd use it for maybe 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and then you just throw it away and pick up another gun. And you really didn't form a relationship with any of your weapons. They were just, this was like the gun of the moment. We wanted you to really get to know an individual gun and feel something for it. We also wanted there to be less junk. Like many games with inventories, Mass Effect 1, you'd be constantly just picking up piles and piles and piles of stuff that was completely useless. The only purpose it had was to be sold to a store for credits, or to be ground up into Omnigel, which you could use to unlock doors, smearing goo on unlock doors. That was a Mass Effect 1 thing. So these were all things we wanted to improve. We also wanted better balance. Balance is always a little weird with single-player RPGs because ultimately it's just not the most important thing. If in a multiplayer game you have to have great balance, but I still think balance is really important even in a single-player RPG because it's part of quality. When there's really, really overpowered combos that are really easy to obtain in particular, it can end up trivializing your overall progression. Mass Effect 1 had a couple of these. The ones that were the most grievous it was very easy to create a soldier build where you essentially became immune to damage all the time. You would just spam this immunity power that made you super hard to kill. You'd be regenerating your health, and you could just keep this power going forever. So at that point, you're no longer playing the game. Some people make up their own game, like they go through the game and they just punch everything to death, and that's novel, but that's not the sort of game we're trying to make. And another really simple issue is just biotic spam. So biotics are our superpowers where you can lift guys in the air or knock them around. If you took a whole bunch of biotic characters in your squad, you would have so much biotics you could knock anybody down. So, and then you can play on the hardest difficulty level. You're knocking guys on the ground, and a lot of the gameplay becomes go into a room, knock everyone to the ground, and then stand over them and shoot your gun into their head while they're getting up. And if they get up, knock them down again. It's just not really great. And there's a bunch of other stuff we wanted to fix. I'm not going to go into all this stuff because it's not really the focus of this talk. It's not really gameplay talk. But there were a bunch of other things we wanted to fix, and I just wanted to acknowledge that. These are important because some of them ended up feeding back into gameplay fixes. A lot of the performance improvements we wanted to do actually helped us get approval to redesign certain systems. Because we could say, hey, this system, it has performance issues, but it also has gameplay issues, so that's two really good reasons to try and rebuild it for both better gameplay and better performance. Okay. So I've been talking about all the things we wanted to do. That's basically covering about a week or two of just brainstorming and talking. But now we had to figure out how do we actually build Mass Effect 2. We knew what we wanted to build, but we didn't know how to build it. So we started off with a documentation approach. And yeah, this was for a variety of reasons, some of them just practical. At this point in the project, all the programmers were either on vacation or they were doing weird programmer things. I'm no longer a programmer, so I can make fun of them. They were optimizing things. It's all I know is that they weren't available to help us really. So we knew what we wanted to fix, and we came up with this massive list of features. It's these are the 30 features that are going to fix Mass Effect and make it awesome. And we wrote detailed specifications for each of these features, and in the end, none of these features shipped. This is just an example of one of the things that we spec'd out. Inventory was definitely the hardest problem to fix. So we actually had a 4 GUI solution for inventory. I know, I wrote the spec. This was one of the original specified upgrade solutions. So it's actually really simple, similar to RE5. You've got points you can put into various stats, and some of the stat bars are grayed out because they have to unlock those. So that was what we were considering at one point. Then we did a bunch of prototyping using the ME1 engine. And again, the programmers are off in programmer land. What can we do? Well, what we can do is we can do simple data changes in Mass Effect 1 and just try and take the Mass Effect 1 engine as far as possible along the lines we want to go to see what we can't do without major redesign. And this ended up being mostly throwaway, but it was actually still really useful because the whole process of just attempting to make changes helped us realize what our systems couldn't do. And overall, at the end of this process, which was actually really fast, we probably maybe spent a month in total on all of this, we weren't happy. We'd done some combat tweaks, so we made the weapons really accurate, but they all felt the same. That's the best way to describe it. Every assault rifle in the game felt the same. They just had a different damage stat or whatever. We didn't get anywhere with, actually, I think these zoom. Come on, are you zooming? There we go. Yeah. Inventory, we weren't actually able to do anything except create documents there because we had no GUI prototyping tools. Takeaway, if you can get your design team some GUI prototyping tools, that will help a lot because so often we're constrained by GUIs. And we didn't know anything about balance at this stage. So overall, things were not looking great, but we weren't really expecting to be able to make the game great without a lot of system changes. But this helped us put everything in perspective so we could really pitch up the chain and say, hey, we've done what we can. We need to do a lot more if we want to achieve the vision that we have for making ME2 a much better game. So we came up with a high-level plan for what approach we would take to try and make Mass Effect 2. So the first thing we decided was that we were going to build shooter combat first. Now, when I say shooter combat first, I don't mean in the sense of priority. I mean in the sense of order. We knew that our shooter combat was the biggest risk area for us for a variety of reasons. It needed a lot of improvement. BioWare is not a studio we're not experts on shooter combat. And it seemed likely that changes here could trickle out and affect all kinds of other systems. So by focusing on our shooter combat first and trying to get that right, we figured we'd remove a lot of uncertainty about other features. We also decided that we needed a gameplay team. Now, depending on what studio you're at, this may seem weird. In a lot of places, it's just obvious. Like, well, yeah, I mean, of course, you need guys who are like the gameplay guys. But BioWare actually didn't have that, at least not on the Mass Effect project. The way we kind of were developing gameplay in ME1, it was very driven by the lead designer talking with anyone on the project who was doing anything related to gameplay. But, he's a busy guy. The projects are getting really, really big. The end result was that a lot of our gameplay was kind of accidental, and it didn't really mesh well together. So the idea here was saying if we have a team that's focused on gameplay that can actually be tasked with solving gameplay problems, potentially by working with other departments, we should be able to have a much more cohesive vision for our gameplay. And the last point was just to not forget labels and make a great game. What this essentially means is don't worry about shooter RPG balance. Even at this early stage, there was a lot of debate going on, like, well, are we making shooter? Are we making an RPG? How much shooter is okay? Maybe this, maybe that. How much RPG is okay? So at least at this stage, I was saying, let's not worry about that. It's really unlikely we're going to accidentally make just a shooter or, just an RPG. We know we're trying to make a great game with shooter and RPG elements. Let's not worry about the balance. Let's focus on making a great game. Okay, so building great shooter gameplay. This being our first focus to try and make sure that Mass Effect 2 is on the right track. We turned off all the RPG systems. So this was probably the most important move of the project. When I say turn off our RPG systems, what I essentially just mean is we temporarily disconnected a bunch of things that were already there. So why would you do that? Well, it was about bringing a sense of focus to the team so everyone would understand we're working on shooter gameplay. So, for example, before I did this, we would have some level designers, and I noticed they were always playing add-ups. And I'd say, oh, well, we're trying to work on guns right now. And they're like, oh, I just like add-ups. I always like throwing guys. That's what I do. It's like, well, okay, but you're building a level that has to be great for shooter players. So I forced them to be soldiers. I said, okay, you know what? You're a level 1 soldier now. Turned off difficulty scaling, turned off treasure, just turned all that stuff off. And the end result is it really helped narrow our focus, because what I didn't want to say is, Mass Effect 2 is a fun game in spite of the shooter combat. I wanted it to be a fun game because of the shooter combat that was even more fun because there was a lot of really other awesome stuff in there. So this was the first step on that. We also analyzed competitors. I think it's really important if you're trying to move into an area where your studio doesn't have a lot of expertise, it's really important to acknowledge that and say, hey, you know what? We need to learn here, guys. We all need to accept that, sure, BioWare, we have this amazing history, some of the best games ever made, but we're not a shooter studio, so we've got to learn from all of the people out there who are making amazing shooters, and not reinvent the wheel. Don't say, oh well, we're BioWare, we're going to do things this way because that's what we do. No, we should start off by trying to make shooter combat that's inspired by and in line with the shooter combat that's already out there that's exceptional, and then if we want to innovate in small areas where there's a really big win. So cover issues. Cover is a really important part of shooter combat if you're making a cover-based shooter. In order to make good shooter combat, we first had to fix the things that made our shooter combat bad. So this is stuff like player input delay and player input loss. That's the sort of stuff that causes your game to feel unresponsive. We actually still ship with a few of these issues, but we got rid of most of them. Safety issues, like if you're in cover and someone's flanking you and shooting you and now you're trying to get out but you're kind of stuck in the cover or you can't turn your camera to see them. Slow animations make it so that, I don't want to get into cover because it takes too long. If I want to get in and get out, that's what leads players to just strafing a lot. And aiming issues, like if it's harder for you to actually shoot a target when you're in cover, the player won't use it. A good way to tell when you're building your game whether or not you have these kinds of cover issues is just watch people playing the game, and people just naturally will either start or stop using cover. If you have to instruct your team and say, hey guys, I want you to always use cover because that's what we're doing, then you have problems. Your team should be naturally using the cover if you've got a good cover system. Oh, this is our magic input test gizmo. I don't think that's what it's actually called, but we got it off the internet, and it was really cool for helping us figure out input delay issues. So you can see we've got basically a mock-up of the 360 controller there and a bunch of lights. So as soon as we press a button on the 360 controller, the light goes on. And what you do is you film someone playing your game, and then you contrast when the light goes on with when the character on screen responds. So for example, let's say you're moving right in cover slowly, and then you switch over to be moving left. How long does it take for Shepard or whoever on screen to actually respond to that and start moving left? Even if it's just a lean, like some sort of visual cue that tells the player what's going on, if there's any significant delay between those lights and the visual feedback on screen, that means your game is going to feel unresponsive to players. And we did a bunch of other cover improvements. We standardized our control scheme. What I mean by this is essentially, this is just the process of saying, if we have a button that does something on the controller, unless we have a really good reason, it should be the exact same button that our competitors are using. Because, sure, maybe we like B and they like A, but players come in and they don't want to have to relearn their control mappings every single time. Like you wouldn't go in and make a shooter where pulling left trigger was fire. Just don't do stuff like that. Aim point preservation was a big one. That's the process of where you haven't leaned out from cover yet, but you're aiming at a guy, and then when you lean out, it's really easy to get the reticule to actually move off of their head, and now that leads to the issues where it's harder to aim in cover than out of cover, and a bunch of other stuff. We also fixed major weapon issues. So in Mass Effect 1, very RPG-ish system, weapons had a lot of combat stats, but the stats didn't really affect the feel of the weapon. Like on a very basic level they would, like how many shots can you take before you run out of ammo or have to reload. But we added a whole bunch of variables, and sort of the exercise that I found really useful for building our weapon system is I would just try and replicate weapons from other games. It's a good way to test to see whether your weapon system is flexible or not. If you can't make a Halo battle rifle in your system, then, well, maybe your system's lacking something. You don't have to ship something that's exactly like the Halo battle rifle, but it's a good way to just find out where your system needs enhancements. We ended up with 108 variables per weapon for tweaking behavior. It was almost entirely procedural. That's another thing I would recommend. Try and stay away from things like animated camera shake on weapon fire, stuff like that. it may be, maybe if you really want to do that, do it just before ship. Go in and remove your procedural stuff and get your animators to animate camera shake, but don't do it during development because it just takes way too long to iterate on. And then once we had a great weapon system, we built a bunch of better weapons. So we ended up with 19 weapons we shipped with, plus a bunch of pre-order bonus weapons. It's kind of interesting because with all these weapons, there's kind of a dual perspective on it. Some people see it as, oh, Mass Effect, they've got like 19 different weapons, including heavy weapons. That's amazing. That's so much variety compared to the first game where you basically had 4 weapons. And other people say, no, Mass Effect 1 had 1,000 weapons. But really, it didn't. Like, it had, the level 4 version of one weapon, the level 5 version, the level 6 version, and they all felt the same. It's a matter of perspective. The last point, this is probably what really contributed to the overall success of this process of building our shooter combat, is just encouraging feedback. Like, make it really clear to everyone on the team, I want to hear your feedback. Just tell me what's going on. And then combine that with watching people play. I would often just be walking through the hallway and I'd see someone playing and I'd come in and just sit by their desk and watch them play, because you get different feedback from your internal team when you watch them play. I also tried to make it clear that there were no sacred cows. I think this is a good idea no matter what organization you are or what your structure is. Just letting people know that, you can come in and suggest anything, even if it's cutting something that is considered to be an integral core part of your game, because it doesn't hurt to discuss it. We have more on sacred cows later. And overall, this took about 3 months. I think it was something like 81 calendar days, but about 3 months to implement the core of Mass Effect 2 shooter combat, which is basically what was seen at E3. And at that point, we turned all the RPG stuff back on. I should mention, by the way, that while the RPG stuff was off, it was still actually in development. We just weren't rolling it out to the entire team because we wanted to keep them focused on shooter combat. Okay. Building for intensity. What this section is really about is it's about saying, when you've nailed something that you really like we nailed our shooter combat feel, how does that end up sort of affecting everything else? I've been thinking a lot about this topic over the course of even this week, and kind of I think a good way to look at it is it's like art direction. Sometimes I think as designers we tend to look at our individual gameplay systems as being not connected to everything else. We're like, oh, okay, I'm going to make this really cool gambling system. I'm going to make this really cool, upgrade system. But in art, you wouldn't build, one piece of art to look one way and in one style and another piece to look in a different way, because it just wouldn't fit. In the same way, you want your gameplay to fit. You want to have a gameplay direction, an overall vision and feel for what your gameplay is, and then make sure that every feature you make fits in with that vision. So class design. Mass Effect 1 had 6 classes, so did Mass Effect 2, but we were actually considering cutting a bunch of the classes because they actually weren't that different. We wanted them to feel different. We said as our goal for the classes is that if you can't actually tell from sort of just watching the way in which someone is moving and fighting what class they are, then that means there isn't enough difference there. So I'm going to show you an example here of Mass Effect 2 Vanguard gameplay. That original Mass Effect 1 gameplay video I showed you at the start, that actually was a Vanguard, by the way, so this is the difference. So, very, very different. When I came up with the vision for the Vanguard class, I don't have to say we for everything, I guess. The idea there was, okay, Mass Effect 1, he's got a shotgun and he's got biotics. But what actually makes him play different? Like, how is he not just an adept with like a few less powers and a shotgun instead of a pistol? Like, what makes him different? So, with Charge, it was a way to just really, really change the feel of the character. Once we added that, the Vanguard became all about getting in close to use your shotgun. And we found that at the start we had some issues with survivability, and we're like, oh, okay, we need to like come up with a way for you to charge in, but then jump right back out. So you're only there for a little bit. And then it was like, no, if you charge in, the way you should respond to the danger of that situation is you charge again, and you'd keep charging. And that's how we built the class, and that's a very different feel than any other class in the game. That video I was showing was actually on the highest difficulty level too, which shows that the style of that gameplay works on all levels, and it's really cool. I love playing as a Vanguard on Insanity because you're forced to be aggressive just to survive, and that's the unique feel of the Vanguard. So let's move on. Look at the Infiltrator, stealth class. It's going in there with a sniper rifle, doing some stealth moves, laying some beats. Again, very different feel than other classes. He's got this nice escape power. He can move behind enemy lines and attack from a point of advantage. So we tried to come up with a similar feel for each of the classes. I think we succeeded. I'm not going to go into the detail on every class. Real-time powers. So I've already talked a bit about the power wheel and basically why I didn't like it. It essentially deflates intensity. I don't mind. If players want to pause while they're playing the game, that's awesome. I pause sometimes while I play. You get into trouble. It's great to be able to bring up the power wheel, pause the game, figure out what you want to do. But forcing the player to pause, saying if you don't pause, you're going to have a gimped experience, that's not awesome. So we really amped up support for real-time powers. The first changes, we made 3 powers mappable for the player, and we also let you map 2 of your squad members' powers. So in Mass Effect 1, you had 1 power you could do in real time. Mass Effect 2, you had 5 powers. And I think I have a separate slide on cooldowns. Yep, global cooldown. So this was the other change we made. In Mass Effect 1, you could have like up to 20 powers going, and they'd all have their own individual cooldown. We moved to a single cooldown system on a per-character basis for a few reasons. The first thing is, if you have 5 powers, but they all have separate cooldowns, and you can only map 3 of them, then it just goes to show that you're going to need to go to the power wheel. You're going to need to pause the game to access those other 2 powers that are inaccessible while in real time. So the global cooldown system let us say that for all of our powers, they have a short cooldown. You can use them again almost immediately, but you can only use 1 power at a time. And this lets you specialize. This lets you focus. So you can say, for example, as an adept, I'm mostly going to use singularity and throw. I've got other powers available, but those are the ones that I map. Those are my favorite powers. Those are the ones I'm putting points into, and I'm going to use them most of the time. And this was a really, really cool change. It was very design limiting because you no longer were able to as easily set up combos. For example, you couldn't like do power 1, power 2 immediately to do a combo. But working within that constraint, learning to work with it, we were able to end up designing it so that you could still have power combos anyway. And a bunch of side benefits came through, like more dependency on your squad members. If you want to, for example, do a combo where you pull a guy and then you warp him, it's really easy to do that if you're an adept, if you bring Miranda with you, because you can use her warp. So this makes her more valuable. It also makes power gameplay more tactical. In Mass Effect 1, as I was saying, biotic spam was a big problem. As soon as your player no longer needs to think about what power they're going to use and just says, well, regardless of the situation, when it starts, I'm just going to use all my powers. I'm just going to spam it all out there. There isn't any tactics there. With a global cooldown system, once you use a power, you can't use any other powers for a short period of time, so you better use the right power. You're going to get rewarded more for using the right power. And another change we made was resistances. So the biotic spam problem, we actually had resistances in Mass Effect 1, though most players didn't even know they were there. If you were a low-level adept and you went up to like an Asari commando and you tried to throw her with a low-level throw, she wouldn't do anything. She would just ignore it. And this was pretty confusing. Like, what does the player think? Well, I don't know. Did my power bug out? I don't know what's going on. And even worse, there was nothing you could do about it. If that Asari commando was resistant to your biotics, you couldn't use biotics on her. So we went with a very simple resistance system where resistances were shown on the health bar. Like here we've got a Geth Prime, and he's got his shields up. And what this means is none of your powers work on him at all. Very, very simple. But it's also actionable. As the player, you can just shoot that guy with your gun, knock his resistances down, and then he'll be vulnerable to all of your powers. Or you could use a specialized power like Overload, which is designed to bring down shields. We also added regenerating health because we thought that would be a really innovative feature to put in a shooter. This was one of those why reinvent the wheel type situations. In Mass Effect 1, we had the first aid power, which you could use with Medigel to heal your squad. And what we actually found during focus testing throughout the course of the project was that defensive powers like that really sap intensity. When you have a first aid power, it essentially means your health bar is twice as big as long as you play like a very minor timing game of remember to heal when I'm getting low health. So it really was creating situations where players would just run up to enemies and they would just play really, really recklessly until they use their first aid power. And then once they use first aid, they'd be like, oh, okay, now I'm in trouble. Now I need to play the game, smarter. So regenerating health, players understand it. It encourages you to act defensively instead of press a defensive button. So getting into cover, that is more than just a way of triggering health regeneration. For a short period of time, you're no longer advancing, you're not firing. The player knows they're taking a defensive action. It changes your whole viewpoint. And the last point was consistent enemy behavior. So enemies in Mass Effect 1, it was, again, very RPG-ish. If you just sort of looked at a screenshot of an enemy and you couldn't see their health bar, you wouldn't necessarily know what that enemy was going to do. Because, you might be facing like, oh, well, this Asari is a soldier. So she's going to shoot me with her gun, and maybe she'll use, immunity. But this other Asari is an adept, so she might use biotic powers on me. And the way you would actually tell is by reading the health bar. And it would say, oh, okay, this is an Asari, adept or whatever. But it was even a little more complicated than that because that Asari adept had a level too. And that level depended on her difficulty. So, if you were level 1, then the Asari adept would be level 9. And she'd have a table that said she gets certain spells at certain levels. You basically couldn't tell what enemies were going to do. So for Mass Effect 2, we wanted to make the enemy behavior more consistent so that you would learn by looking at this enemy, oh, okay, I recognize this enemy, I know what they do, so that you could spend more time in the game playing and less time reading health bars. This is an area where I think we still need to improve a lot. Our silhouettes are still very similar, for example. So sometimes, if you're looking at an Eclipse mercenary, it might be hard to tell what their abilities are unless you look really intensely for those subtle visual cues that differentiate what class they are. That's weird. Is there? Okay, RPG systems. Yes. Okay. So now I'm going to talk about some of the RPG systems in Mass Effect 2 and how they were shaped by this overall approach to intense combat. Come on. Yay. Okay. So I came up with a list of values that I thought described our process. We're trying to make RPG systems that were easy to use but not dumbed down. And the idea there is avoiding complexity for its own sake. Being a hardcore D&D player, I love complex RPG systems, and I love them for their own sake. Like coming up with big systems that interact in really cool ways that's awesome. But in particular for a console RPG, it's really hard to come up with systems like that and then really communicate them effectively to the player. Getting the player to understand even basic things can be very, very hard. So getting them to understand really complex things is essentially impossible. We also wanted every feature to impact the first playthrough. There were a few key features in Mass Effect 1 that were really awesome, like bonus powers that you really just couldn't access on your first playthrough. And while it's heartbreaking, the vast, vast, vast majority of players will only play your game once, no matter how awesome it is. And if your game's over 40 hours long, the majority of your players probably won't even finish the game. So it's really important to make sure that all this work you're doing is front-loaded so that players can actually benefit from it. We also were saying that progression should be meaningful and it should affect gameplay. The idea there is just to try and say, let's keep in mind that we want the benefits of this RPG progression to be something you can see in the game without stopping and going to a menu. We didn't, the most obvious example of where you run into issues like that is things like where you're like, okay, these shoulders give me plus 3% damage or a 2% critical hit chance, stuff that you can't really visualize in the game. And we did still end up with some of those in Mass Effect 2, but we got rid of as many as we could. The last one was designed for 360. Mass Effect and Mass Effect 2 are both PC and Xbox games. This is just really common sense, though. If you're making something for multiple platforms, you want to design for the one with the most restricted interface first. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a lot of issues on the more sort of like simpler restricted system with communicating with your player. So here's the ME1 level up screen, and as the quote says, even I don't know what all this stuff is. That's actually a lie, but I had to actually look it all up to remember. So you got a bunch of skills here. Like, how many is that? 6, 7, 8, 9, I don't know. More than 10 skills. And if you're not an ME1 expert and you're looking at this, some of these things make sense. Like you can say, oh, okay, pistols. If I like pistols, I'm going to put points in that. That's awesome. But what's fitness? Does fitness, help me on the treadmill, or does it mean I can run faster? What's assault training? Is that something that's going to make it better when I'm trying to like run? But isn't fitness for running? I don't know. So the way you actually know what any of this stuff does is you highlight it and then you read the description. Another sad thing is the vast majority of your players will not read any text you put in the game, especially GUI text. They'll only read it when they're blocked and they have essentially no other way to progress. Here's the ME2 level up. So this is much simpler, much more streamlined. We've got six abilities there that you can put points into. And except for combat mastery, they're all powers. So adrenaline rush is what you put points into if you want to make your adrenaline rush better. Let's actually back up here again. Like, the soldier has powers too. Like, soldier has shield boost in Mass Effect 1, and he's got carnage, but, I mean, how do you make those better? Well, I know because I played the game. Actually, I don't even know if I do remember how to make shield boost better. But you have to essentially look through there and figure out, oh, okay, I need to put points into my shotgun to make my carnage power better. It's not super intuitive. But here it's, if I like using disruptor ammo, I put points in disruptor ammo, that makes it better. And we still have all the detailed information available for the players who want to read it, but the player no longer has to read it. The one ability we have that isn't a power is called combat mastery, and that at least sounds awesome. So the player's like, oh yeah, combat mastery, I want to do that. I'm going to master combat. When Mass Effect 2 launched, I actually spent a lot of time watching people play the game on Justin.tv. Evil place, but good for research. Another tip, if you want to save money on focus testing, though it's a little bit too late, when the week before your game comes out, go to Justin.tv. There'll be tons of people playing it, broadcasting on the internet. You can't stop them. Send as many takedown notices as you want. Another one will just pop up. But it's cool because you can actually see players playing your game for the first time and reacting. And one of the things I noticed when I was watching people playing Mass Effect 2 who were not really RPGers is they'd all play soldiers and they were just maxing out combat mastery. They just loved it. No idea what it was doing, but they were maxing it out. Armor personalization. So that's another system we added for Mass Effect 2. And in Mass Effect 1, your appearance was essentially random. You would generally want to wear whatever armor you found that had the best possible stats, but you didn't really get to choose. Some players would say, oh no, I really like the look of this armor, I'm going to wear it, but they were actually punished for doing so. We tried to make an interface where, I guess I don't have a zoom there. We tried to make an interface where the player could do a lot of customization. We added stats to armor based on focus testing feedback, where some players we originally didn't have any stats at all. It was just look as cool as you like. But some focus testers early on said, no, I want to have some other reason why I want to change my appearance, so we put that in. Interesting note is that the color change feature was the most popular feature by far. People just really liked making their armor black or red and changing the pattern on it. So that's a big potential win. If you want to make a customization system, make sure you have that in. And then research and upgrades. So as part of understanding like our core sort of gameplay vision, to put it in a nutshell, it's that while you're on a mission, we want you to be engaged in these kind of like 3 core activities: combat, narrative, and exploration. And really exploration is for us kind of a small one. It's mostly combat and narrative. So most of the time when we're setting up our pacing, it's based off fights, either low intensity or high intensity fights, and periodic conversations, which can also be low or high intensity. In Mass Effect 1, while you were playing through the level, you'd have to do a bunch of other stuff besides engaging in those activities. You might just leveled up pretty much randomly in Mass Effect. Every once in a while you'd level up. It's like, oh, got to spend some squad points. You might even level up in the middle of combat. And actually in the middle of combat, pause the game, go to your level up screen, start spending points. By the time you get out of there, you don't even remember what's going on. We wanted to move a lot of this to happen in between missions. So with the research and upgrade system, what we essentially said is while you're on a mission, you might find a new research project or an upgrade, but you don't really need to worry about that right now. We're going to let you know, hey, you've got this awesome upgrade, but the actual process of building the upgrade happens outside of the mission. Oh, we had the email feature. I mostly just put this in because I wanted to put the Penny Arcade comic in my presentation. Love those guys. And more. So I don't have time to go into every single RPG feature we added, but here's like a list of other RPG systems we either added or brought forward. New Game Plus, it kind of does not hit my rule for it should be accessible on the first playthrough, but it's such a popular feature. That was an example where we had a feature that we actually cut, but based on fan feedback, we put it back in because they said it was really, really important to them. Respec's another feature I added that kind of falls under the category of respecting your player's time, which is something I think that all RPG manufacturers need to understand and really pay attention to these days. You're no longer making games for the guy who wants the 100-hour game. So yeah, a respec option basically means that the player has the option of trying different builds without having to create a brand new character and play through the game again. Controversial changes. So this is some more RPG stuff, but this is the more controversial stuff. Where did my inventory go? All right. I don't know how long I've been talking, but this is kind of like one of the major questions that players have been asking. So just looking over the stats and what our goals were. For Mass Effect 1, we had 5 squad members plus Shepard and a complex inventory. And we needed to make a much better, much more awesome inventory. But we also needed to support up to 12 squad members. Our last squad member was recently announced, by the way, Kasumi. She's going to be available on Xbox Live soon. So 12 squad members plus Shepard, and managing gear has to be really, really easy. I spent a lot of time looking at various RPG systems for inventory. Couldn't find one that worked. I couldn't find something that would be easy for managing that huge number of characters. So, what's going on here? There we go. Sorry for the low-res screenshot. This is just showing you the Mass Effect 1 inventory screen. Still pains me to look at it. Oh, this is another pet peeve I have with inventory systems. This is from my Dragon Age playthrough. And essentially, I stopped using Alistair at some point, so I just stripped him for all of his stuff, kind of like stripping a car. And he was hanging around in my camp all the time, naked. It's actually not too bad, but I really didn't like that feel of stripping your squad members for parts. So we went to the squad inventory system. I've been saying throughout this presentation kind of like we have no inventory, we have no inventory. We do have an inventory. It's just so incredibly simple that some people say it's effectively not an inventory system. But I quite like it, actually. The core idea was to stop you from having to move lots of different inventory objects around in a space. It's more of a qualification system of saying, like, are you qualified to use this assault rifle? This makes perfect sense within the IP as well. Mass Effect, it's an advanced sci-fi future. Fabrication is very common. Your Omni tool, which you come with, if you read the codex entry, it actually has a full fabrication unit in it. It can manufacture stuff for you. So the idea that you would actually be able to build whatever your squad needed, it makes a lot of sense. It's always been a little weird. It's like Commander Shepard, the most advanced spaceship in the galaxy, off to save the world, but, he has to go and haggle to get one more assault rifle for his crew. So yeah, we got rid of the inventory system and we turned it into a system where you would just say, oh, okay, Tally, you use this shotgun and I don't have to take it away from someone else. You can just use it. We also put auto upgrade in, and this was another accessibility feature. At one point, I actually didn't even want to have an interface for changing upgrade options at all. I was thinking, you know what, let's just do auto upgrades. But definitely what people really like the ability to tweak. Even if there isn't a need for it, strictly from a mechanics perspective, knowing that at the start of every mission you'll be given the chance to choose what weapons all your squad members are using is comforting to players, even if they don't engage the feature very much. Ammo, another big debate point. So this was probably the most controversial change on the team in Mass Effect 2. And this was a change I actually didn't want to make. When not all these ideas came from me. I didn't want to put ammo in the game. It seemed like a really wacky idea. But we ended up doing it for a really good reason. So there was a whole bunch of small problems that we were having with our combat, just really weird situations. And they were all sapping intensity. With Mass Effect 1's original ammo, heat system, which is essentially saying you fire until your weapon overheats and then you wait and then you fire it again and then you wait, but you can never run out of bullets, you're missing that sense that you're spending a resource. So what this encourages a lot of weird spamming tactics that are not very fun. Like, for example, I've done this myself. You might be running down a hall and you're trying to get to some cover and there's an enemy there. You're like, oh, well, I might as well fire while I'm running. I'm very inaccurate, but I'm just going to hold down the trigger and fire because, bullets are free. It feels weird, but you do it anyway. Another thing is you might get into an encounter and the first thing you might think is, oh, you know what? I'm going to run away. We're out of time? Yes. Oh, no. Okay, I'm going to super zip through this to just get a few last points here. Mining game. No one likes the mining game. Did lots of communication with fans. I used a lot of social networking stuff to get their feedback. Really good to get fan feedback. And the big lessons learned. When you make a small change, like making our weapons accurate, it can really, really cascade through to affect a bunch of other systems. It's hard to get people to understand these changes. A lot of players were really surprised by Mass Effect 2 when it came out, even though we tried to communicate at a very high level to them what was going on. It's important to know your weaknesses. If you don't have a lot of experience in an area, make sure you're working hard to build up that experience. And having a vision for your overall gameplay instead of designing individual gameplay systems in a not connected way is very, very important. Thank you all for coming. Please fill out the sheets This is my first talk, and I really want to get your feedback. At the start of GDC, everyone tends to give 5s to everybody, and then they say, oh, well, now I've seen Rob Pardo talk. And I know I'm not Rob Pardo, but I hope you enjoyed my talk.